She was not just another passenger. Eleanor Kane sat in seat 3A. Calm, composed, unaware that within minutes, she would become the center of a storm at 35,000 feet. She had paid for her seat. She had boarded like everyone else. But when a flight attendant demanded to see her ticket when no one else in first class had been questioned, Eleanor knew exactly what this was. Doubt, wrapped in procedure, disguised as policy, carried by the quiet, insidious belief that someone like her did not belong. But what Caroline Birch, the flight attendant who challenged her, didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that Eleanor Kane owned the airline. And in just a few hours, Caroline's entire world would come crashing down. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from. And if you love gripping stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Now, let's begin. The hum of the engines was a steady thing, a gentle vibration that wrapped the first-class cabin in a cocoon of privilege. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched endless under the glare of the afternoon sun, heat rising in shimmering waves. Inside, the world moved slower, a hushed conversation, a quiet clink of glass against glass, the occasional rustle of fabric as passengers adjusted themselves into the plush luxury of their oversized seats. Eleanor Kane settled in, letting her gaze drift beyond the thin pane of glass beside her. She had always loved this moment, the pause before ascent, the stillness before the great machine lifted itself into the sky, defying gravity, stretching itself toward something higher. It was a familiar metaphor, one she knew too well. She exhaled, reaching for her leather carry-on, tucking it neatly beneath the seat in front of her. She did not expect a grand welcome. She did not demand it. That was the privilege of a different kind of wealth, the wealth that was assumed. Inherited, never questioned. No, Eleanor Kane had spent too much time navigating rooms where her presence required explanation. Too many years building an empire that could only move in silence. Because the moment it announced itself, the moment it made a sound, someone, somewhere, would question its right to be there. She had spent a lifetime making sure no one could. And yet, excuse me, miss. The voice was sharp, cutting through the ambient murmur of the cabin. She turned slowly, deliberately. A woman stood over her, chin lifted, uniform pressed and starched into perfection. Caroline Birch. Eleanor knew the type. She had met them in hotel lobbies, in boardrooms, in boutique shops where the salespeople only softened once they saw the black card slide across the counter. "I need to see your ticket," Caroline said, her voice edged with something Eleanor recognized. Not curiosity, not professionalism, doubt. A small, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the space around them. A pause in the quiet conversations. A flicker of interest from the man in 3C, who had been engrossed in his phone but now stole a glance over the rim of his reading glasses. Eleanor did not move immediately. She had learned, over time, that patience was its own kind of power. She reached into her bag, pulling out the boarding pass, and placed it in Caroline's waiting hand. Caroline's eyes flickered across the paper, scanning the details. Seat 3A, first class, Eleanor Kane. It was correct. Still, she hesitated. "Are you sure this is your seat?" The words landed like an old bruise, pressed just enough to remind her it was still there. Eleanor inhaled slowly, the air in the cabin suddenly feeling heavier. She had flown on her own airline a dozen times, perhaps more. And yet there was always someone who needed her to prove she belonged. She extended her hand, palm up. "If there's an issue," she said, her voice measured, "I'd like my ticket back." Caroline hesitated, her fingers tightening around the slip of paper. And that hesitation, that pause, that moment of indecision was the real insult. Because it was not just about the seat. It was about the question itself. The man in 3C sipped his whiskey, watching now. A woman a few rows ahead, flipping through a magazine, slowed her movements just slightly. They were listening, but they wouldn't say anything. They never did. Caroline forced a smile, the kind of smile meant to soften a slap. Just making sure. Sometimes mistakes happen. Mistake. That was the word she chose. Not misunderstanding, not confusion. Mistake. Eleanor's lips pressed together, but she said nothing, because this was the game. A game she had played too many times to count. A game where the rules were unwritten but understood. People like Caroline Birch did not ask men like the one in 3C for their tickets. They did not question the young blonde woman 2 rows ahead, already half lost in the glossy pages of Vogue. No, they questioned her, because somewhere, deep in their minds, deep in the bones of this country, there was an order to things. And Eleanor Kane had just disrupted it. Caroline handed the ticket back, but her fingers lingered a moment too long, as if reluctant to let it go. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped. Then, she turned, walking briskly down the aisle, her shoulders squared as though she had done a service, as though she had restored balance to something that should have never been tilted in the first place. Eleanor watched her go, watched the stiff line of her back, the careful, calculated steps, and she knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in her stomach, that this was not over. Caroline Birch was not done. Because women like her never liked to be wrong. And when she came back, she would not be coming alone. Outside, the last of the luggage was being loaded onto the plane. Inside, the air had changed. The first-class cabin was still quiet, but it was no longer still. Eleanor turned back to the window, watching as the world outside shrank, preparing for the moment when the wheels would leave the ground. It was going to be a long flight. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour. The hum of the engines was steady. The world outside a vast stretch of blue and white. The kind of sky that seemed endless until you remembered the weight of gravity waiting below. Inside the first-class cabin, the quiet had settled back in, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The kind of quiet that followed an unspoken question. The kind of quiet that lingered when something was out of place. Eleanor Kane had seen it before, felt it before. She had spent years walking into rooms where the temperature shifted upon her arrival, where she became the unspoken subject of whispered conversations, where the expectation of her presence was not anticipated but tolerated. That was what this was. A quiet tolerance. She did not need to turn her head to know that the man in 3C was still stealing glances at her over the rim of his whiskey glass. She did not need to lift her gaze to feel the ripple of subtle curiosity running through the other passengers. The lingering question hanging in the air like perfume. Why had she been asked? Why had she been singled out? And yet, no one asked. Because this was how it worked. They would sit with their discomfort, sip their champagne, pretend they hadn't noticed. The world moved forward, as it always did, brushing past these moments as though they were nothing at all. Eleanor had let it go, because she knew that was what was expected. She had returned to her book, her posture unbothered, her breathing even, but beneath it all, something coiled in the pit of her stomach. Something sharp and familiar, something that told her that the moment had not yet passed. And then, footsteps. Deliberate, quick, a certain rhythm of movement that carried intent. She felt it before she saw her. Caroline Birch had returned, and this time, she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant followed behind her, young, unsure, the kind of woman who had not yet learned how to wear authority like armor. She was watching Caroline with careful, hesitant eyes. The way people watch fires when they are not yet sure if they will spread. Eleanor inhaled once, slowly. She placed her book in her lap. She lifted her gaze. Caroline stopped at her seat. The moment stretched long enough for the air in the cabin to shift again. For conversations to pause mid-sentence. For heads to turn ever so slightly. "Miss Kane," Caroline said, her voice now heavier, edged with something sharp, something final. "I need you to come with me." It was not a question. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering her, the careful arrangement of her expression, the way her mouth had pressed into a thin, tight line, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "Excuse me?" Eleanor said, her tone light, measured, dangerously calm. Caroline exhaled, as if forcing patience into herself. "I need to have a private conversation with you." Eleanor held her gaze, steady, unwavering. "If there is something you need to say, you can say it here." A flicker of something crossed Caroline's face, then irritation. Frustration, maybe even something deeper, something more insidious. The younger flight attendant shifted, clearing her throat. "Ms. Birch, what's the issue?" Caroline didn't turn to her. She didn't acknowledge the question. Instead, she squared her shoulders. "This is not a discussion," she said, her voice tightening. "Please step out of your seat." The hush that fell over the cabin then was different than before. It was heavier, thicker. Eleanor remained still, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. And if I don't? Caroline's nostrils flared. Then I'll have security waiting when we land. And there it was. The shift from doubt to decision. From suspicion to force. This was not about policy. It had never been about policy. This was about control. And the moment Eleanor had not immediately yielded, had not immediately bent, the need to reinforce that control had become a demand. The passengers were watching now. The man in 3C had lowered his glass. The woman 2 rows ahead was no longer flipping through her magazine. The young flight attendant beside Caroline was now frowning, her hesitation growing into something closer to alarm. Ms. Birch, she tried again, this time firmer. What exactly is going on here? Caroline's jaw tightened. She's refusing to cooperate, she said, her voice clipped. The young attendant blinked. With what? Silence. And then, Eleanor leaned back in her seat, exhaling through her nose, slow and deliberate. She hasn't actually said why she wants me to move, Eleanor said, turning her head slightly. I think we'd all like to hear it. The young attendant hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned to Caroline. Ms. Birch, she said carefully. What's the problem? Another beat of silence. Caroline hesitated, just a second too long. And that second, that brief, fleeting second was enough. Because now, everyone could feel it. The thing that had been buried under protocol and professionalism. The thing that had existed beneath the surface of this moment from the very beginning. Caroline swallowed once, and then, she took a breath, straightened her spine, and spoke the words that would unravel her completely. I don't believe she's supposed to be in this seat. The hush that followed was electric. Eleanor blinked once, slowly. The man in 3C exhaled sharply, shaking his head. A few rows back, a woman scoffed under her breath. The young attendant stiffened. Ms. Birch, she said, voice now almost frantic. You already checked her ticket. Caroline's fingers twitched. I need to verify it again. A sharp breath from one of the passengers. A murmur spreading like ripples in still water. Eleanor inhaled deeply, reached into her bag, and pulled out her ticket. Slowly, deliberately, she held it up for everyone to see. Here, she said, voice even. Go ahead, verify it again. And this time, Caroline hesitated for far too long. This time, she knew she had already lost. The younger flight attendant took the ticket before Caroline could, scanning it with quick, precise movements. And then, without looking up, she let out a slow breath. She's in the right seat, she said. More murmurs, a shift in the air. And then, Eleanor saw it. The panic in Caroline's eyes. The realization. And before she could stop herself, before she could think, Caroline did the one thing she should have never done. She reached out and grabbed Eleanor's arm. It wasn't rough. It wasn't violent. But it was enough. Enough for the hush in the cabin to turn into a collective inhale. Sharp and startled. Enough for the murmurs to turn into voices. For passengers to stiffen in their seats. Enough for Eleanor to know that, in this moment, Caroline Birch had made a fatal mistake. Because now, this wasn't just about a question. Now, this was about something else entirely. And the moment Caroline realized it, the moment she felt the air shift, the moment she saw the slow, dangerous smile curl at the edge of Eleanor's lips, she knew it too. She had just destroyed herself. And Eleanor Kane, calm, composed, completely unshaken, was about to show her just how badly. The air inside the first-class cabin did not move. For a single, stretched-out second, nothing existed except the pressure of Caroline Birch's fingers wrapped around Eleanor Kane's arm. It wasn't tight, it wasn't violent, but it was a boundary crossed. A silent but undeniable shift from questioning to control, from suspicion to force. And in that moment, Eleanor understood exactly what was happening. There was always a line. A thin, trembling, invisible line between assumption and action, between bias and power, between the silent language of doubt and the very real consequences of what happened when that doubt was given hands. Given authority, given the weight of institution. And now, here they were. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not yank her arm away. She did not make a sound. Instead, she lifted her gaze, slow and deliberate, and met Caroline Birch's eyes with a look that did not waver. A look that did not ask for permission. A look that had been earned through years of knowing. Years of navigating rooms where her presence was not expected. Years of smiling politely while the world questioned, always questioned, whether she had a right to exist in the spaces she had built with her own 2 hands. Caroline's fingers twitched. The realization dawned too late. A beat of silence. And then, a sharp intake of breath. Not Eleanor's, not Caroline's, but from the cabin. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch could no longer pretend. A man 2 rows back let out a quiet, startled exhale. The young flight attendant beside Caroline, Mary. That was her name. Eleanor thought absently, her lips parted. Her fingers clenching around the tray she still held as if she wasn't sure whether to drop it or use it as a shield. David Langston in 3C, who had been watching with quiet amusement up until now, set his glass down entirely. The moment stretched unbearably thin. And then, Eleanor moved. Not her arm, not her body, just her free hand. She reached into her lap, lifted her phone, pressed a single button, and placed it to her ear. Gate control, she said, her voice smooth, calm, precise. This is Eleanor Kane. A pause. Owner of Kane International Airways. The words landed like a bomb. A ripple of sound moved through the cabin. Murmurs, shifting bodies, a sharp inhale from someone in the back who had only been half listening until now. Caroline's breath hitched. Her hand recoiled as if burned. Eleanor did not move, did not break her gaze. There has been an incident with a member of your in-flight crew. She continued, her voice as steady as the plane beneath them. I will be filing a formal report upon landing. Caroline's throat bobbed. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Somewhere near the galley, a flight attendant whispered something hurriedly into an intercom. Mary stepped forward, her face pale. Miss Kane, I didn't realize. Eleanor lifted a single finger. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but it silenced Mary instantly. She wasn't interested in apologies. Not yet. Caroline took a step back. Then another. She wasn't breathing right. Her face had gone stiff. Her fingers trembling at her sides. Her world, so carefully ordered, was slipping through her fingers like sand. And she had nothing to hold on to. Eleanor lowered her phone slightly. Just enough to let the silence settle. Then, slowly, carefully, she tilted her head. Tell me, she said, voice like glass cutting through velvet. What exactly made you believe I wasn't supposed to be in this seat? Caroline opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Passengers were waiting now, watching. David Langston smirked, folding his arms across his chest. Oh, he murmured under his breath. Now this is interesting. Mary, who had moments ago been hesitant, took a small but definitive step away from Caroline. The woman 2 rows ahead who had been flipping through a magazine let it drop into her lap, shaking her head in something close to vindication. But Eleanor wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Caroline. She had been in this situation before. Not this exact one, no, but close enough. A store clerk asking her only her for ID. A hotel concierge subtly implying she must have wandered into the wrong lobby. A boardroom full of men staring at her as if waiting for someone else. Someone they had expected to walk through the door instead of her. But none of those moments had mattered. Because none of them had been this public. None of them had happened here. On a plane she owned. With a cabin full of witnesses. Caroline inhaled sharply. Eleanor lifted a brow. Caroline swallowed. The moment stretched unbearably long. And then, the intercom crackled. A voice, low and controlled, filled the cabin. Elena Rowan, the captain's voice called, his tone unreadable. Please report to the cockpit immediately. Caroline's body jerked at the sound of her name. Her breath caught. She turned, eyes wide, searching for someone who could save her. But there was no one. Mary wasn't standing beside her anymore. Passengers had leaned back in their seats. Some looking away, others watching with the sharp, quiet satisfaction of a story they knew would be told for years. And Eleanor simply smirked. Not wide, not arrogant, just enough for Caroline to see it. Enough for her to understand. This was not a game she could win. This was not a power she could bend. And now, there was nowhere left for her to go. The cabin door to the cockpit opened. Another flight attendant stood there, expectant, waiting. Caroline's hands curled into fists at her sides. Then, slowly, stiffly, she turned. She walked toward the front of the plane. Her steps slow, deliberate, heavy with the weight of her own undoing. Passengers whispered. Phones angled ever so slightly. Eleanor exhaled once, a quiet, steady breath. And then, just as Caroline reached the cockpit door, she spoke. Not loudly, not cruelly, Just enough for her to hear. "I told you," Eleanor murmured. Caroline stopped cold. Eleanor let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "You should have just given me back my ticket." The words did not need to be loud to be deafening. Caroline flinched. Then, the cockpit door closed behind her. The world inside the cabin shifted once more. And Eleanor Kane, unbothered, untouched, undefeated, lifted her phone, leaned back in her seat, and let the quiet power of the moment wash over her. The fight was over, but the consequences were only just beginning. The cabin door clicked shut behind Caroline Birch, and the weight of her absence settled like a sudden drop in altitude. The air did not immediately rush back into the space she had occupied. It lingered, dense and electric, charged with the undeniable truth that something had just happened, something that could not be undone. Something that could not be walked back with an empty apology or a shallow excuse. For a moment, no one moved, and then, a sharp exhale from the woman in 5B, who had watched the entire thing unfold with barely concealed irritation. A low, known chuckle from David Langston in 3C. The sound curling at the edges with something like amusement, something like satisfaction. A murmur from the back, one voice brushing against another. The first ripples of what would become a wave. A story that would travel far beyond this plane, beyond this day. And Eleanor Kane. Eleanor did not move. She had already won. She did not need to gloat. She did not need to speak. She simply existed, as she always had, as she always would. But the world was shifting around her. And she knew it. She had not sought this moment. But she had known long before she stepped onto this plane. Long before she had taken her seat in 3A that moments like this were always waiting. Coiled in the bones of this country. Lurking in the spaces where doubt disguised itself as procedure. Where prejudice draped itself in professionalism. She had known, but knowing had never made it easier. The soft chime of the intercom cut through the tension. The captain's voice threading through the air like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Eleanor exhaled, slow and steady, fingers tracing the edge of the boarding pass still tucked in her lap. She had come here for a flight. Instead, she had become a reckoning. The descent. As the plane began to lower, the hush of the cabin gave way to movement. Passengers stretched, adjusted their seats, reached for their drinks, but no one was truly at ease. Because everyone was waiting. Waiting to see what would happen next. Waiting to see what price would be paid. Waiting to see how a moment like this would end. And then, the cockpit door opened. Caroline Birch stepped out, and the world shifted again. She was not the same woman who had walked into that room minutes before. She was paler, her posture stiffer, her lips pressed into a line so tight it might have disappeared entirely. The authority she had worn like armor had cracked, and through the fractures, something raw and unfamiliar flickered in her eyes. Fear. The passengers saw it. Mary saw it. Eleanor saw it. And Caroline knew she saw it. She did not speak as she moved down the aisle. Her steps slower than before. Her hands clasped so tightly they had lost all color. Passengers did not look away this time. They let their eyes follow her. Let their curiosity become something tangible. Something that she could feel pressing against her skin like an accusation. She walked past Eleanor's seat without looking at her. But that did not matter. Because Eleanor had already seen everything she needed to see. Caroline Birch had entered the cockpit believing she still had control. And she had emerged knowing she had lost it. Landing in the aftermath. The plane touched down with a jolt. Tires meeting concrete. The momentum pressing passengers back into their seats before the world settled again. The seatbelt sign blinked off. A rustle of movement as passengers reached for their bags. Prepared to disembark. Ready to step back into their lives as if this had been any other flight. As if this had been just another routine journey through the sky. But it wasn't. It never would be. Because when the door opened, when the jet bridge locked into place, when the first-class cabin emptied itself into the waiting arms of the airport terminal, there were men standing at the gate. 2 of them, uniformed, waiting. And for the first time since this all began, Caroline Birch stopped moving. Her breath hitched. Her hands, still clasped, twitched. Her eyes darted toward Eleanor just for a moment. Just for a flicker of something desperate. Something pleading. Something that looked dangerously close to regret. But Eleanor did not give her anything in return. Because regret was not enough. Because regret did not erase intent. Because regret did not rewrite history. A voice crackled over the airport speakers. Caroline Birch, please step forward. Passengers hesitated, pausing just long enough to witness the moment stretch into something unbearable. Something permanent. And then, slowly, so very painfully slowly, Caroline moved. Each step toward the uniformed officers was heavier than the last. Her shoulders curling inward, her spine bowing under the weight of a decision she had made without ever realizing it would cost her everything. Eleanor watched her go, the same way she had watched her arrive. Silent, steady, unmoved. This was how it always happened. Not with fury, not with rage, but with the quiet, devastating weight of truth. Because the truth was simple. Caroline Birch had not lost her job today because she had questioned a passenger. She had lost it because she had believed deep in her bones, without hesitation, that Eleanor Kane did not belong. And she had acted on it. And now, she would pay for it. The airport swallowed her whole. The uniforms guiding her toward the inevitable conversation. The meeting with the review board. The final decision that had already been made long before this flight had even landed. And Eleanor picked up her bag, adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, and stepped into the terminal without looking back. She did not need to. Caroline Birch was no longer her concern. The world had a way of handling people like her. And Eleanor Kane. Eleanor had places to be. The airport terminal stretched wide and endless, filled with the constant motion of lives passing through departures and arrivals. Greetings and farewells. The churn of existence moving forward. Indifferent to whatever storm had just unfolded in the sky above. Eleanor Kane moved through it without hurry. She was not the kind of woman who rushed. She had never had the luxury of moving too quickly, of allowing herself to be careless with space, with presence. No, she had spent a lifetime mastering the art of control, of measured steps, of occupying power without demanding it. She had learned, long ago, that the world did not like to be reminded when someone like her was in charge. And yet, here she was. She did not look back. There was no need, because she knew what was happening behind her. Caroline Birch was standing in a small, windowless office now, the kind of space designed to strip a person of whatever authority they once held. She was facing the cold stare of an airline executive, her fingers twisting in her lap, her throat tightening as she was informed officially that she was being placed on immediate leave. Pending review. She was trying to explain herself. No doubt. Trying to rationalize what had happened. Trying to find the right combination of words to undo what she had done. But there was no undoing this. Because the truth was not in what she would say in that room. Behind closed doors. To people who would measure her worth in corporate liability. The truth was in what had already happened. In the way she had looked at Eleanor Kane and decided, without hesitation, that she did not belong. And now, she was paying for it. But consequence was a strange thing. Because consequence was not the same as understanding. Caroline Birch was losing her job today. But she was not losing her place in the world. She was not losing the privilege that had allowed her to act as she did in the first place. She was not losing the certainty that, somewhere, there would be a second chance waiting for her. She was not losing the ability to walk into a new room, a new position, and be believed when she said, "That wasn't me. That was a mistake. That was just one bad day." No, she was not losing what mattered most. But what she had lost, what she could never recover, was the illusion of her own invincibility. The watchful eyes of the world. Eleanor reached the curb outside the terminal. The weight of the day pressing into her shoulders in ways she did not allow herself to show. A black car waited for her. Sleek and silent. The driver already stepping forward to open the door. She could feel the eyes on her. Not from the security officers. Not from the executives moving through the terminal in their crisp suits and tired eyes. But from the passengers. The ones who had been on that flight. The ones who had watched the moment unfold. Who had seen the shift. Who had felt, if only briefly, the weight of the truth pressing against them. Some looked at her with something close to admiration. A quiet respect for the way she had handled herself. For the calm power she had wielded without raising her voice. Some avoided her gaze altogether. Uncomfortable with their own silence. Their own inaction. Their own unwillingness to speak when they had known, in the deepest part of themselves, that they should have. And some watched with the lingering question of what if? What if she hadn't been the owner? What if she had not held that power in her name, in her wealth, In the infrastructure of the very airline that had tried to dismiss her? What if she had been just another passenger? Would anyone have intervened? Would anyone have spoken for her? Or would they have done what they had been taught to do? Would they have stayed silent? Would they have let the moment pass? Let the injustice slip by? Let the weight of history repeat itself? Again and again and again? Eleanor knew the answer. And so did they. She slid into the car without a word, letting the door close behind her with the quiet finality of something ending. The unspoken war. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of traffic, the city rising around her in steel and glass and shadow. She let out a slow breath. There was no victory in this. Not really. Because the fight was not new. Because the battle had been fought before. Because even as she sat there, calm and composed, another woman was being questioned in another space. Another room. Another airport. Because the war was not in the grand moments, in the courtroom battles or the public reckonings. The war was in the small things. The subtle things. The glance that lasted too long. The unnecessary question. The doubt that wrapped itself in politeness. The hand that lingered where it was not welcome. The feeling, deep and quiet and constant, that no matter how much power you held, there would always be someone who believed you did not deserve it. Eleanor had won today. But tomorrow, the battle would begin again. And the world would keep turning. And the people who had watched would go home, carrying the weight of what they had seen. And some of them, just some, would remember. And maybe, just maybe, the next time the moment came, the next time the unspoken war pressed against their skin, the next time a question disguised as procedure tried to erase a person's place in the world, maybe, this time, they would not stay silent. Eleanor tilted her head back against the seat, eyes closing for just a moment. Then, she straightened. The car kept moving, and the world outside moved with it. The city blurred past Eleanor's window. A symphony of movement, of lives intersecting, of people rushing toward destinations both important and meaningless. The car moved smoothly, guided by the quiet certainty of the driver's hands. But inside, something unsettled coiled deep within her chest. She had been here before. Not in this exact car. Not leaving this exact airport. But in this feeling. This aftershock. This moment between the storm and the silence that followed. The world outside had moved on. But she had not. Not yet. Because she knew with the weight of history pressing into her bones that what had happened on that plane was not an isolated moment. It was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a symptom. A symptom of something that had always been there. Something that still pulsed beneath the surface of every interaction, every space she occupied. And it would happen again. Not to her, perhaps, not for a while, but to someone else, somewhere else, because the war was never truly over. It only waited for the next battle. A call in the dark. The phone rang, its vibration a low hum against her thigh. She glanced down, already knowing who it would be before she even saw the name. James Connor. Senior Operations Manager, the man whose job, at this moment, was to clean up the mess that had unfolded in first class. She let it ring twice before answering. Ms. Kane. James's voice was steady, professional, but there was something just beneath it, something careful, something cautious. James. A pause. She could hear the way he inhaled, how he measured the air before speaking, how he was choosing his words with precision, with intention. We want to assure you that this situation is being handled. Eleanor smiled. It was a small thing. A private thing. A knowing thing. Is that so? Yes, he said, too quickly. Caroline Birch has been placed on immediate suspension, pending full review. The board will meet first thing in the morning to discuss permanent action. Permanent action. The polite way of saying that Caroline Birch was finished. Eleanor let the words sit between them for a moment, turning them over in her mind. Measuring their weight. Suspended. Reviewed. Removed. None of it would change what had happened. None of it would stop it from happening again. She exhaled, slow and deliberate. Tell me, James, she said, her voice smooth as glass. If I hadn't been the owner, how would this have ended? Silence. She could hear the way he swallowed. She could feel the way he hesitated. Because they both knew the answer. The story would have been different. The outcome would have been different. If she had been another passenger, another woman, another name on a ticket with no weight behind it, no power attached to it, would the pilot have been called? Would security have waited at the gate? Would Caroline Birch have been escorted out of that plane in disgrace? Or would Eleanor have been the one removed? Would she have been the one told to calm down? To comply? To accept that mistakes happen? She already knew. And so did James. "Miss Kane," he said carefully, "you have my personal assurance that—" She cut him off with a quiet chuckle. "James," she said, tilting her head slightly, watching the city lights flicker against the car window. "Do you think I got here by believing in assurances?" He didn't answer. Because there was no answer. She let the silence stretch. Let it wrap around him like a weight. Let him feel the depth of the moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't need assurances," she said, her voice steady. "I need you to understand that this was never about one flight attendant. This was never about one incident. This was about something far deeper than a name on a passenger manifest." Another pause. James inhaled again, slower this time. "I understand," she sighed, leaning back into the leather seat, letting her fingers graze the edge of her bracelet. "No," she murmured, "you don't. But maybe, just maybe, he would." The shadow that lingers. The call ended. The night pressed in around her. The city kept moving, unbothered, unchanged. But she was changed. Not in the way people thought. Not in a way that could be seen, or spoken, or softened by the right combination of apologies and corporate promises. No, she was changed in the way a person is changed when they are reminded violently, undeniably, that no matter how high they rise, no matter how much they build, no matter how much power they hold, there will always be someone who believes they do not belong. It was not bitterness that curled in her chest. It was not anger. It was something else, something deeper, something older, something that whispered to her in a voice she had always known, in a language she had spoken since birth. Stay ready. Because the battle was never over. Because the next moment was always waiting. And because, at the end of the day, the war was not just about her. It was about all of them. Every woman like her. Every person who had ever sat in a seat they had paid for and still been asked to prove they belonged. Every name on a manifest that someone, somewhere, decided was a mistake. And so, as the car carried her deeper into the city, as the night stretched long and endless before her, she did the only thing she had ever known how to do. She sat up, she straightened her shoulders, and she prepared for the next fight. The city pulsed with its own rhythm, a living thing wrapped in neon and shadow, humming with the weight of 1,000 lives moving at once. The car weaved through its arteries, gliding past storefronts and high-rises, past the dim glow of streetlights casting long, distorted shapes on the pavement below. Eleanor Kane watched it all pass by, her reflection barely visible in the window, her face half-shadowed, half-illuminated. She was thinking, not about the flight, not about Caroline Birch, not even about the moment security had stepped forward, not about the hush that had fallen over the cabin when her name had turned the tide of power. No, she was thinking about something deeper, something older than this one moment, something that had lived inside her since the first time she had been made to explain herself, to justify her place in a space that did not expect her. It was not the incident that haunted her. It was the knowing. Because when you know, when you see the pattern for what it is, when you have spent a lifetime learning the shape of it, feeling its edges press into your skin, you can never unsee it. And that was the cost. That was what they never understood. That was what men like James Connor, men like the ones who had watched in silence on that plane, the ones who had shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing, that was what they would never have to carry. Because for them, it was an event. For her, it was a reality. A truth that did not fade with distance. A wound that did not heal simply because the world had decided it was time to move on. The weight of silence. The car slowed, pulling up to the entrance of her building. The smooth glass doors reflecting the city back at itself. The driver stepped out, moving with the efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before. Opening the door, waiting with quiet patience. Eleanor did not move immediately. She sat there, hands folded in her lap, staring at the world outside, thinking, feeling, and then, finally, she exhaled and stepped out. The air was thick with the remnants of the day's heat, carrying the scent of rain that had yet to fall. She smoothed the front of her coat, adjusted the delicate bracelet on her wrist, the only thing that had ever marked her wealth in moments like these. The only thing that some people ever seemed to notice about her. Inside the lobby, the concierge greeted her with a nod. His smile tight, respectful. She saw it. The slight hesitation. The flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had seen the news. Because of course it was already out there. Of course, the whispers had already started. She had known, from the moment Caroline Birch's fingers had tightened around her arm, that this was never going to stay confined to the walls of that plane. The world loved a spectacle. Especially when it involved power shifting in ways it was not supposed to. She took the elevator in silence. The soft ding announcing each floor. The doors opening to the quiet hush of the corridor outside her penthouse. Home. But even here, even in this place she had built, she felt it. The weight of the day pressing against her ribs. The heaviness of a truth she had carried for far too long. She locked the door behind her, stepping into the vast, open stillness of her space. The floor-to-ceiling windows casting long stretches of night across the polished hardwood floors. And then finally she allowed herself to feel it. A reckoning in the dark. She placed her bag down carefully. Unclipped her bracelet, set it on the table. And for the first time since she had stepped onto that plane. Since the moment Caroline Birch's voice had cut through the quiet, demanding a ticket that had already been shown. She let herself breathe. Deep. Slow. A breath that had been held too long. A breath that had been stolen too many times before. She did not cry. She did not collapse beneath the weight of it. Because she had learned, long ago, that the world did not stop for women like her. It did not make room for their exhaustion. It did not allow them to break. But it did watch. And right now, this very moment, she knew that somewhere, someone was reading the story of what had happened on that plane. And they were making a decision. They were deciding if she had been right to push back. They were deciding if Caroline Birch had really done anything wrong. They were deciding if this had been an injustice. Or just another inconvenience. And that, she realized, was what exhausted her most of all. Not the moment itself. Not the confrontation. But the knowing. Knowing that for every person who saw this for what it was, there would be another who would twist it into something else. A misunderstanding. An overreaction. A mistake. Because the truth of it, the raw, ugly truth, was that the world would rather believe in the mistakes of a Caroline Birch than in the experience of an Eleanor Kane. Because the world did not like to look too closely at the cracks in its own foundation. It preferred its illusions. Preferred its assurances. Preferred to believe that it had moved forward, rather than acknowledge the ways in which it had only learned to mask itself better. The next battle. Eleanor reached for her phone. She opened the first article. Scrolled past the words she had already known would be there. High-profile airline executive involved in in-flight confrontation. Passenger incident sparks debate over professionalism and bias. And there it was. The debate. As if her humanity was up for discussion. As if the reality of what had happened was something to be weighed and measured and considered. Instead of simply known. She set the phone down. She let the city hum around her. And she understood. This was not the end of it. There would be more. More conversations. More interviews. More moments just like this. Stretched out into infinity. Looping back on themselves. Repeating with new faces. New names. But the same story. Because power does not surrender easily. And neither does ignorance. And so, Eleanor straightened. She squared her shoulders. And she prepared for what came next. Because there was always a next. Because the fight was never just one flight. Because the battle was never just about her. Because if she was tired, if she was exhausted by the weight of it, then she owed it to herself. And to every woman who would sit in 3A after her. To make sure it was worth something. She turned off the phone. She turned off the lights. And somewhere in the city below, the world kept moving. And Eleanor Kane, she moved with it. Morning came slowly, stretching its fingers through the glass and steel of the city. Casting shadows that blurred the line between night and day. The world had already begun its motion. The rhythm of routine swallowing the weight of what had happened the night before. But Eleanor Kane knew. She knew that even as the sun rose, the story had not been left behind in the dark. It was still moving. It was still growing. And somewhere, someone was deciding what it all meant. She stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the streets below. The world was indifferent. It always was. It did not stop for reckoning. Did not pause for reflection. It simply moved forward. And yet, something was different now. Because it was not only the world that had seen what had happened. It was the people within it. And they would carry that moment with them. Whether they wanted to or not. The morning after the fall. The first call came before she had even finished her coffee. James Connor. Again. His voice was measured, cautious, but she could hear it, the exhaustion. The weight of navigating something far beyond corporate procedure. Ms. Kane, he said, hesitating just a second too long before continuing. The board has reached a decision. Eleanor sipped her coffee. Go on. A pause. Then, Caroline Birch has been terminated. Effective immediately. The words did not surprise her. She had known, from the moment the cabin fell silent, from the moment security had been called, that there was no coming back for Caroline. But what struck her was not the decision itself. It was what it represented. Caroline Birch had spent years enforcing order in spaces where she believed she was the authority. She had walked through those aisles with certainty, carrying the weight of a power she had never been forced to question. Until now. Until one mistake, one assumption, had unraveled everything she had built. But Eleanor did not fool herself. This was not justice. This was containment. A corporation protecting itself. A company ensuring that the problem did not spread beyond what could be managed. Controlled, cleaned up, because the problem was never just Caroline Birch. The problem was the world that had made her. The problem was the countless others who had done the same thing and faced no consequence. The problem was not one woman's mistake. It was the system that had told her she could make it without thinking twice. Eleanor exhaled. I see. James cleared his throat. The company will also be issuing a formal statement. She smiled slightly, her gaze never leaving the window. And what will it say? Another pause. Then, carefully, he recited it. We take incidents like this very seriously and are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. Eleanor let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. The script was always the same. Polite, carefully crafted, but empty. Because dignity had never been the issue. Belonging had. And a statement would not change that. James hesitated again, as if he could feel the weight of her silence. Ms. Kane, if there's anything we can do to. There is, she interrupted smoothly. A sharp inhale on his end. She could feel his hesitation. The fear of what she might ask. The fear that she would demand something outside of their control. She let the silence stretch before finally speaking again. Make sure it doesn't just end here. Another pause. Then, softer. I understand. But she knew he didn't. Not really. Not yet. The difference between winning and changing. The news had already spread. Her name was in the headlines. Not just in business circles. Not just among airline executives. But everywhere. Morning talk shows. Online debates. Social media threads dissecting every angle. Some defended her. Some condemned her. Some asked the same tired question they always did when someone like her demanded accountability. Was it really that serious? She had seen it before. The twisting, the reframing, the subtle shifting of blame. They would not say that Caroline Birch had been wrong. They would say that she had been misguided. They would not say that Eleanor had been right to push back. They would ask whether she had been too harsh. Because the truth was that the world did not like to see power shift. Not like this. Not in public. Not in a way that could not be ignored. The woman who didn't look away. Hours later, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was not James. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. But something instinct, curiosity, something older than both made her pick up. A voice on the other end. Soft, uncertain. Miss Kane? Eleanor didn't answer right away. Yes? A breath. Then, my name is Angela. I was on your flight. Angela. One of the flight attendants. Eleanor stayed silent, waiting. Angela hesitated. Then, quietly, carefully. I just wanted to say I saw what happened. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened slightly. Angela exhaled, her voice lowering. I saw it, and I didn't do anything. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could hear it, the guilt, the self-recrimination, the knowledge that she had been there, that she had known, and that she had stayed silent. But what could she say? What comfort could she offer? This was the world they lived in, and silence had always been its strongest weapon. Angela spoke again, her words barely above a whisper. I won't stay quiet next time. Eleanor's breath caught. She opened her eyes, looked out at the city stretching endlessly before her. And in that moment, she felt something shift. Because change did not happen in the grand, sweeping gestures. It did not happen in the corporate statements or the carefully worded apologies. It happened in the small moments. The moments where someone, somewhere, decided that the next time history tried to repeat itself, they would not let it. Eleanor exhaled, slow and steady, and for the first time since that flight, she felt something close to hope. Good, she said simply. Angela's breath hitched on the other end of the line. And then, softly, thank you. The call ended. Eleanor set her phone down. The day stretched ahead of her. The city kept moving. The world kept turning. And somewhere, in some small, unseen space, a new battle had already begun. But this time, maybe just maybe, she wouldn't be fighting it alone.